2.5 decades ago, Turkey seemed to be embracing Western liberal democracy. Restrictions on free speech were relaxing. The country was enacting reforms in pursuit of EU membership, and Turkey's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, spoke of human rights and expanding minority freedoms. Today, that version of Turkey is basically unrecognizable. The country has undergone a massive political and cultural transformation under Erdogan, moving toward a more nationalist, Islamist, and authoritarian-leaning country. An interesting new book from journalist Susie Hansen seeks to understand Turkey's evolution or devolution and how it has impacted everyday life there. In that book, From Life Itself, Turkey, Istanbul, and a Neighborhood in the Age of Erdogan, Hansen observes one neighborhood in Istanbul over a decade to try to understand the changes that have taken place there. I began by asking her why Turkey has moved down the path of a liberal democracy.
I moved there in 2007, so that was the second election of Erdogan as prime minister, and it felt like Turkey was becoming a more democratic country, certainly, than in the past, and that it was primarily because of him and the AKP. And I think that is partially because he recognized that there were all of these people in the society who had been left behind to some degree by the political process, and he welcomed them into this new party that he created. And I think that what happened is a really interesting question. You know, is this a case where Tayyip Erdogan was always going to become an authoritarian or a strong man because of something within his personality or because of his lust for power? Or was this also a product of the times that we're living in, and was he actually radicalized by a number of major events that were happening over those 20 years? And I think there are two ways to look at it. What you have during that time period, is, especially when Turkey was very much being considered for the European Union, was the global financial crisis. It caused him to turn away from the West and look towards markets in the Middle East. You had protests against his government in 2013 that were very, very threatening to him. Those were the Gezi Park protests.
You had the European leaders ruling out that Turkey would ever be a member of the European Union. Remember, that was, I traveled to Turkey a little bit after, and they were shocked by that. I think it was Merkel and Sarkozy got together and said,
definitely,
essentially, you're not a Christian country, you'll never be part of the European Union.
Absolutely, and the Turks felt that. And someone like Erdogan, who is incredibly proud, knew exactly how to capitalize on that rejection and say, well, we don't need you. You know, we are an independent country, and you'll see this time and time again as his regime develops over time. So I think it was all of those things, but also one thing I really try to point to is the Syrian civil war as another major factor in his radicalization, because as we know, when people get involved in wars abroad, they tend to become more repressive at home. But then I think a major decision that he made was to very much welcome millions of Syrians into Turkey, and to use rhetoric that suggested, well, we are a great Muslim power and we are going to welcome our Muslim brothers, very different from most autocrats. But it also gave him a card to play on the world stage with those refugees, which he used in often very unpleasant ways.
So one of the things that you might be able to tell through this neighborhood, because you were living it at the, you know, in this kind of granular level, when you see the rise of this kind of a liberal democracy, whether it's in Hungary or in Turkey for a while, in Poland, is it that the public was never actually that secular, that liberal? You know, this was something of a Western facade that Ataturk had placed on Turkey, and that, you know, you scratch beneath the surface and you discover actually they're totally comfortable with it. Or was Erdogan a mastermind who was able to manipulate them and get them to this place?
I think the secularist population and the people who made up, you know, more of the people who were Ataturk's followers, it's a very strong part of Turkey. But I think, again, as we were saying, the people who were left behind and certainly were left out of Ataturk's modernizing reforms were these people from the countryside and who were more religious. And those people left behind their farms in the mid-20th century and onward, and came into the cities, and they were lost to some degree. I mean, they needed someone to speak to their experience. So in my neighborhood in Karagümrük, you really had this division. Most of them were pro-Erdogan. There were a lot of very religious people, but you still had the old guard, you know, the people who were upset about the arrival of these more religious people who dressed in very, very conservative ways. And these people were to some degree not even speaking the same language, I think. But One thing I would suggest is that, yes, the religious people, even by 2025, were still supporting Erdogan. But there was another contingent that Erdogan tapped into, which were these people who loved the prosperity that he brought to the country and the economic development and the illusion that, not even the illusion, I mean, he was building canals and bridges.
No, the economy quadrupled in size.
Exactly, and that also gave them a better sense of themselves, and they could look at their children and they could say, oh, well, we had to walk to school, you have bus service, your lives have vastly improved. But it's those people who would end up shattered in the end. And I think the interesting thing for authoritarians, countries that are going through this autocratizing process, is when does that moment strike people? When does it, even when people have gone along for 5 years, 10 years supporting this leader, when does it strike them that their lives have changed? And I think that was something I was able to see play out because I stayed in this neighborhood for 10 years.
Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.